When I asked my son about the wedding date, his wife said, "We got married yesterday. It's only for special people." A week later, she called, "The rent is overdue. Did you transfer it?" I replied with one phrase, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also, let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Sandra Holloway, and I am 61 years old. I have lived in the same house in Columbus, Ohio for 34 years. The yellow house on Birchwood Lane with the cracked front step that my late husband Gerald always meant to fix and never did. After Gerald passed from a heart attack 7 years ago, that house became both my anchor and my quiet burden. I kept it. I kept the cracked step. I kept his old cardigan hanging by the back door. Some things you don't move, not because you can't, but because moving them would mean admitting too much. My son Daniel is 32. He has Gerald's jawline and my stubbornness, which is a difficult combination to live with, and I say that with full love. He grew up in that yellow house, played baseball in the backyard, got a scholarship to Ohio State, studied accounting, and became a decent, hard-working man. For a long time, it was just the two of us. A quiet life, phone calls on Sundays, holiday dinners, the occasional argument that dissolved in a day. We were close. I believed we were close. Then he met Kayla. She came into his life 3 years ago, introduced casually over the phone as someone I've been seeing. I didn't meet her until 4 months in, which felt long, but I told myself that was just how young people did things now. When I finally met her, at a restaurant downtown, not at my home, not at a family gathering, she was polished and pretty, with a bright smile that arrived a half-second too late, like a reflex rather than a feeling. She called me Sandra immediately, without asking, which I noted but dismissed. She talked about herself at length. She did not ask about Gerald. She ordered the most expensive thing on the menu. I told myself I was being too critical. Mothers always are, with daughters-in-law. I had promised myself I would not be that kind of mother. Over the following months, Daniel called less. Not dramatically less, not enough to point to and say, "This is a problem," but enough that I felt it like a draft under a door. Our Sunday calls shifted to every other Sunday, then to when he had time. When I asked about Kayla, his answers were brief, rehearsed sounding, as though he were reading from approved talking points. When I asked when I might see them again, he said they'd been busy. They were always busy. The first real warning sign came 8 months into their relationship when Daniel mentioned, in passing, almost as a footnote, that he and Kayla had moved in together. He had not told me before they moved. I found out the same weekend it happened. When I said I would have loved to help, to bring things over, to be part of it, he said Kayla preferred a low-key transition. I remember sitting with the phone in my hand after we hung up, looking at Gerald's cardigan by the back door and feeling a shift in something I couldn't yet name. The second warning sign, money. Daniel had always been responsible with money. Gerald and I had raised him that way. But that winter, he mentioned he was a little stretched and asked if I could help cover his car insurance for 2 months. Of course, I said yes. Then in the spring, there was a gap in the rent. I covered it. I told myself these were temporary, that young couples struggle. I transferred the money without complaint because I loved my son and I did not want to make things harder for him. What I didn't know then, what I would only understand later, was that the money was never going toward what I was told it was going toward. The third warning sign was the silence around the relationship itself. No engagement announcement, No talk of the future. When I gently asked Daniel once, over the phone, whether things were serious with Kayla, he laughed and said, "Mom, relax." I relaxed. I tried to. And then, one Sunday evening in October, I was at my kitchen table drinking chamomile tea, the yard going dark outside the window. Daniel called. It was a short call, pleasant enough. Near the end, I asked something simple, something a mother asks. I asked when I might expect a wedding. There was a pause, a brief reshuffling of sound on the line, and then Kayla's voice came through, sharp, clean, unhurried. And she said, "We got married yesterday. It was only for special people." I said nothing for a moment. The tea had gone cold. Daniel did not correct her. He did not soften it. He said, "Yeah, it was small, Mom," and moved the conversation along as though she had said something entirely reasonable. I set the phone down on the table when we hung up. I looked at the cracked step through the window. I looked at the cardigan by the door, and I sat with what had just been done to me. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the bedroom that Gerald and I had shared for 26 years, staring at the ceiling in the dark, and I let myself feel the full weight of it. Not just the words. It was only for special people, but everything beneath them. The deliberate exclusion, the casual cruelty of telling me the day after, the fact that my son had married a woman and not told me, not called me the morning of, not asked me to stand somewhere nearby even at a distance. Nothing. I had not been invited to my own son's wedding. I got up at 3 a.m. and went to the kitchen table, the same table where I'd been sitting when the call came, and I started writing. Not a letter, not yet, just a list. I needed to see it all in one place, written down in my own handwriting, because I was already beginning to gaslight myself, already beginning to think, maybe I'm overreacting, maybe this is normal, maybe I'm the difficult one. The list was longer than I expected. In the past 14 months, I had given Daniel money 7 times. I went back through my bank records. I keep a paper ledger, Gerald's habit, one I had kept up, and I wrote down every transfer. Car insurance, $340. Rent gap in March, $1,200. Kayla's medical bill in June. Daniel had called it urgent, $780. Groceries twice, $150 and $200. Utilities in August, $310. And most recently, 2 weeks before the wedding I was not told about, security deposit on a new place, $1,800. Total, $4,780. I sat with that number for a long time. It wasn't a fortune. I wasn't a wealthy woman. I lived on Gerald's pension and my part-time bookkeeping work for a local dentist's office. But it was real money, transferred in good faith, always with the quiet hope that I was helping my son build his life. And now I had to ask myself, whose life had I actually been building? Because Kayla did not work full-time. Daniel had mentioned this once, carefully, as though it were a minor detail. She was between opportunities, he'd said. She had a background in marketing, had done some freelance work, was figuring things out. And yet they lived in an apartment in a decent neighborhood, ate at restaurants, and Kayla, from what I could see on her social media, which she had not blocked me from yet, wore new clothes regularly and posted photographs from weekend trips that Daniel never mentioned to me. I was not a suspicious person by nature. I want to be clear about that. I had always given people the benefit of the doubt. I had raised Daniel to be honest, to be accountable, and for 30 years he had been. But sitting at that kitchen table at 4 a.m. with my ledger open and my heart breaking quietly, I understood something that I had been resisting for months. Kayla was not a young woman finding her footing. She was a young woman who had identified a resource and was managing it carefully. And that resource was me. The fear came next. Not fear of her exactly, but fear of what I was about to have to do. Fear of the conversation with Daniel. Fear of being called jealous, controlling, the difficult mother-in-law. Fear of losing him entirely if I pushed too hard. Kayla had already drawn the boundary clearly. Only special people. I had already been sorted. If I made noise, she would use that sorting against me. She would tell Daniel that I was trying to destroy their marriage, that I couldn't accept their happiness, that I was the problem. I knew how this story went. I had watched it happen to other women, but I also knew that doing nothing was its own kind of decision. Staying silent was not the same as staying safe, and I had spent 7 years since Gerald died learning, slowly, painfully, that I was more capable than I gave myself credit for. I had managed the house alone. I had handled his estate alone. I had rebuilt a quiet, dignified life alone. I was not going to be managed. By the time the sun came up over Birchwood Lane, I had made a decision. I was not going to call Daniel in anger. I was not going to confront Kayla by text, where she could screenshot and distort. I was not going to perform hurt and hope someone felt guilty. I was going to be deliberate, methodical. I was going to understand exactly what I was dealing with before I made a single move. My first step was information. I needed to know what I actually knew, what I could prove, and what was my instinct versus verifiable fact. I would start with the money, because money, unlike feelings, leaves a trail. And I would talk to someone I trusted before I did anything else. That someone was my sister Renee. Renee lived 40 minutes away in Westerville, in a townhouse she'd bought after her own divorce 12 years ago. She was 2 years older than me, sharper in ways that sometimes annoyed me and now felt like a gift. When I called her that Monday morning, I didn't dramatize. I read her the list, all 7 transfers, all the amounts, and then I told her about the wedding. There was a long silence on her end. "Sandra," she said finally, "how long have you been covering their rent?" "I wasn't covering rent," I said. "I was helping with gaps." "That's the same thing." I drove to Westerville that afternoon. We sat at Renee's kitchen table. She made coffee, real coffee, not the instant I kept at home. And we went through everything together. Renee had worked in HR for 20 years before retiring. She'd seen manipulation in professional settings and recognized its architecture. She didn't tell me I was overreacting. She didn't tell me to call Daniel and work it out. She listened, asked precise questions, and when I finished, she said, "You need to stop the transfers first, before anything else. No more money moves until you understand what's happening." That was step 1. The next morning, I called Patricia Owens, a financial advisor I had used once when settling Gerald's estate. She was in her 50s, practical, no nonsense. I laid out the situation without emotion. Amounts, dates, purposes stated versus purposes I now questioned. Patricia listened, then asked whether I had anything in writing. Texts, emails, confirming what the money was for. I did. Daniel always texted before I transferred. I had every message saved in my phone, automatically backed up to my email. Patricia told me to screenshot everything and save it to a secure folder offline. "Not because you're going to court," she said carefully, "but because clarity is always better than memory when money is involved." I spent that evening doing exactly that. 41 text messages, 7 transfers, every one of them documented. And that was when I found it. Going back through the chain from August, the $310 utilities payment, I noticed something I had missed in the moment. Daniel's text had said, "Mom, Kayla's really stressed about the utilities shut-off. Can you help just this once?" Standard enough. But below it, I had forwarded the transfer confirmation to Daniel, and he had replied, "Got it, we'll tell her." Will tell her. Not thank you. Not we really appreciate it. Not even I'll make sure it's taken care of. Just, we'll tell her. As though he were a messenger. As though Kayla had asked, Daniel had relayed, and Kayla would be notified of the result. I stared at that message for a long time in my bedroom, the lamp on, the house quiet around me. I went back further. The June medical bill, $780. Daniel's text, "Kayla had an unexpected expense. It's embarrassing for her to ask, but we're really stuck." And after the transfer, she says thank you. Not we, not I, she. The March rent. "Kayla's worried about the landlord. She asked me to ask if you could help." After the transfer, she's relieved. Every single request had Kayla's name in it. Every single acknowledgement reported back to Kayla's emotional state. Daniel was not coming to me because they were struggling together. Daniel was coming to me because Kayla was sending him. I pressed my back against the headboard and breathed. This was not a young couple going through hard times. This was a system. Kayla had constructed a system in which Daniel served as the intermediary, keeping his hands clean, keeping my sympathy directed at my son rather than my skepticism directed at her, while she controlled the flow of requests and managed the results. She had probably calculated that I would never say no to Daniel, and she had been right. For 14 months, she had been completely right. The next day, I drove downtown and walked into the office of Ellen Marsh, a family law attorney whose name Renee had given me. I wasn't sure I needed a lawyer. I told Ellen that up front, but I wanted to understand my position, legally, practically, before I made any moves that could be used against me. Ellen was in her mid-40s, direct, with the kind of steady attention that made you feel your problem was being taken seriously. I gave her the summary. She asked a few questions. Then she said something that shifted the frame entirely. "Has Daniel ever been added to your accounts? Does he have any power of attorney?" He did not. Then the money was given voluntarily, and there's no legal obligation on their part to repay it unless there was a written agreement stating it was a loan. She paused. "Going forward, however, you have every right to stop. You have every right to set conditions. And if they put pressure on you, implicit or explicit, to continue giving, that pressure can become relevant." I drove home on the highway with the afternoon sun low and flat in my eyes. By the time I pulled into Birchwood Lane, Daniel had texted me twice. The messages were brief, casual. "Checking in," he said. "How are you doing, Mom?" It was the first time he had texted me first in 3 weeks. Kayla had noticed something. I did not respond to Daniel's texts that evening, not out of cruelty. I want to be clear about that because the cruelty was never mine to deploy, but because I needed 48 hours to put the next steps in place before any conversation happened. Responding before I was ready would only give Kayla something to react to, and I had decided that I would not be reactive anymore. I had been reactive for 14 months. It had cost me $4,780 and my seat at my son's wedding. The following morning, I went to my bank and made 2 changes. First, I set up a transfer alert on my account. Any outgoing transfer over $100 would now require a secondary confirmation via a phone call to the branch, a small friction I put in place deliberately. Second, I moved a portion of my savings into a separate account that I had opened in my name only, linked to nothing Daniel had ever seen. Patricia had suggested this, not to hide assets, which would have been its own problem, but to create a clear, documented boundary between my financial life and the one I had been inadvertently funding. The branch manager, a young man named Todd who had helped me before, asked if everything was all right. I told him I was reorganizing for retirement planning. He nodded and processed everything without further questions. I was back home by noon. At 2:17 in the afternoon, Kayla called. Not Daniel, Kayla. This was the first time she had ever called me directly. In 3 years, our communication had been almost entirely through Daniel, with the occasional brief exchange at the one dinner we'd managed before the pandemic made gatherings easy to avoid. The fact that she was calling me directly meant she knew. She had watched whatever signals she'd been reading. Daniel's check-in texts going unanswered, some shift in his energy, something in her own calculations. And she had decided to act before I did. I let it ring once. Then I answered. Sandra. Her voice was composed, friendly even. I just wanted to reach out personally. I feel like we've had kind of a distance, and I'd love to change that. I said, Hello, Kayla. Daniel mentioned the rent is coming up, she said, pivoting so quickly from warmth to business that the warmth collapsed immediately under its own weight. We're a little short this month again. I know it's a lot to ask, but if you could transfer by Friday, that would really help. I was sitting at my kitchen table. The ledger was in front of me, closed. The sun was coming through the window over the sink. Everything was very still. I said, I won't be making any more transfers. Silence. Then, sorry? I won't be sending money, I said. Not this month, and not going forward. Another silence, and then the warmth was entirely gone. Sandra, I think you need to understand that Daniel is your son. Her voice had dropped, not louder, but heavier. And the way you've been pulling back lately, not answering his messages, and now this, that's going to affect your relationship with him. I just want you to think about what you're doing. There it was, the threat dressed as concern. Think about your relationship with your son. I have thought about it, I said, carefully. This is really hurtful, she said, after everything we've been through. I did not ask what everything referred to. I already knew it would be a list I hadn't been given notice of, full of grievances I hadn't been allowed to address in real time. I hope you and Daniel find a way to manage the rent, I said. I'm not the right person to help with that anymore. She hung up. 40 minutes later, Daniel called. His voice was tight, confused, the voice of a man who had been briefed. He said he didn't understand what was happening, that Kayla was upset, that I was creating drama. I told him I loved him, that I was not creating anything, and that I would be happy to have a proper conversation with him, in person, just the two of us, when he was ready for one. He said Kayla would need to be included in any conversation about family finances. I noted that. I told him I'd be in touch. He hung up. I sat in my living room for a while after that, in Gerald's armchair. I had moved it in there from the bedroom 2 years ago, when I stopped being able to sleep and started sitting up late. And I let the shaking in my hands slow down, because my hands had been shaking through both calls, not from fear exactly, from the effort of staying still when everything in me wanted to either apologize or shout. I did neither. For the next 4 days, I did nothing regarding Daniel or Kayla. I tended my garden. I went to work at the dentist's office on Tuesday and Thursday. I had dinner with Renee on Wednesday. I slept, genuinely slept, for the first time in weeks. I let the silence sit between us. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop. On the 5th day, a text came from Daniel. Not from Kayla, from Daniel. It was longer than his usual messages, and I could feel the authorship beneath the words. the way a ventriloquist's lips move slightly even when they're trying to be still. "Mom, Kayla wanted me to tell you she's sorry if the call came across wrong. She's been under a lot of stress and she really does want to have a relationship with you. She was hoping the four of us could have dinner. Her parents would be there too, just to clear the air and start fresh. She said to tell you that she thinks of you as family." I read it twice. Then I set my phone face down on the counter and made my morning coffee. She thinks of you as family. This from the woman who had told me on the phone, the day after her wedding, that the ceremony had been reserved for special people. I understood what this was. The direct approach, the threatening call, had not worked. So now came the soft redirect. Dinner with her parents, witnesses on her side, a social setting where any expression of grievance on my part would be framed as ruining a reconciliation. I would arrive at that dinner as the problem that needed solving, and I would leave having been managed. I was not going to that dinner. I texted Daniel back, just him, directly, not addressing Kayla's message, and I said, "I love you, and I'm always open to a conversation with you. I'm not ready for a group dinner. When you want to have lunch, just the two of us, let me know." He did not respond for 2 days. That silence used to devastate me. There had been a time, not long ago, when Daniel's silence sent me spiraling, reaching for the phone, trying to smooth things over, apologizing for I wasn't sure what. Kayla had trained that reflex. I understood now. The silence was a tool. When Daniel went quiet, I had historically stepped forward to fill the gap, always at a cost. I let the silence be. During those days, I drove out to see Margaret Holloway, no relation, an old friend of Gerald's family who had become one of my closest confidants over the years. Margaret was 74, a retired school teacher with a dry wit and a long memory for human behavior. I had known her for 30 years. I trusted her the way I had trusted Gerald, not because she always agreed with me, but because she always told me the truth. We sat on her screened porch in the late afternoon, tea and a plate of ginger snaps between us, and I told her everything. The full arc. The money, the wedding, the call, the texts. Margaret listened without interrupting. She was one of the rare people who could do that. And when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking out at her yard. "The dinner offer," she said. "What were her parents there for, do you think?" "Witnesses," I said. "Or pressure. Or both." Margaret nodded. "You know what you're doing, Sandra. You're not looking for permission. I'm looking for confirmation that I'm not losing my mind." "You're not losing your mind." She picked up a ginger snap. "You've just been very patient for a very long time, and patience has a cost that people don't always calculate." She looked at me steadily. "The question is what you want now, not what you want to avoid. What you want." I thought about it honestly, sitting there on her porch with the late light going golden through the screen. What I wanted was my son back, the real one, the one who called me on Sundays and told me about his week and asked how my garden was coming. I wanted the relationship that had existed before Kayla had placed herself between us and redirected every current of his attention and loyalty through her own hands first. I could not force that. I knew that. I could not extract Daniel from a dynamic he was choosing, however much that choice had been shaped for him. But I could stop participating in my own diminishment. I could stop being the resource that funded a life designed to exclude me. And I could make sure that when everything came to light, and I believe now that it would, I had been consistent, documented, and clear. Margaret walked me to my car when I left. She held both my hands for a moment on the driveway. "Call me any time," she said, "day or night." I drove home on the county road, windows down, the corn high on either side. The evening was warm and the sky was going pink, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something that wasn't dread. I felt ready. They came on a Saturday morning, unannounced. I was in the backyard when I heard the car pull up. Daniel's gray Civic, the one with the slightly bent front fender from a parking lot incident 2 years ago that I had not helped pay for, though I remembered now that Kayla had asked. I came through the side gate and found them standing on my front porch before they had a chance to ring the bell. Daniel looked pale and slightly rehearsed. Kayla looked composed in the particular way that takes effort, the kind of composure that isn't calm but is a performance of calm, held in place by will. I looked at them both for a moment. Then I said, "Come in." We sat in the living room. I did not offer coffee, which was a deliberate choice, not hostility, but a refusal to perform the domestic warmth that had always been used as a backdrop to make difficult things feel softer than they were. Gerald's armchair was to my left. I did not sit in it. I sat on the couch across from them, straight-backed, hands in my lap. Kayla began. She was good at this. I'll give her that. She led with vulnerability. She said she knew they had started off on the wrong foot with me, that she had never had a close relationship with her own mother and didn't always know how to navigate family dynamics, that she hoped I could understand she had never meant to hurt me. Her eyes were appropriately wet. Her voice was appropriately unsteady. She even reached over and touched Daniel's hand at one point, as though drawing strength from him, or perhaps reminding him which side he was sitting on. It was a genuinely impressive performance, and for a brief moment, a very brief moment, I felt the old pull, the desire to reach across and say it's okay, let's start over. But then she pivoted. I think what's been hardest for us, she said, shifting from I to us without pausing, is feeling like you've pulled back right when we needed support the most. Daniel is your son, and the financial help you've given us, we were counting on it. It wasn't a handout for us, it was family taking care of family, and to have it just stop, without a conversation, without warning. She shook her head. That's been really destabilizing. There was the word, destabilizing. Not hurtful, not confusing, destabilizing. A word that implied I had disrupted a structure that was functioning, that I had been a pillar they had built upon, and that removing myself was an act of aggression against their stability. She had chosen that word carefully. I was certain of it. We were building something, she continued, pressing forward now, leaning slightly toward me. Daniel and I both work hard. You know how expensive everything is right now. The rent, the groceries, the utilities. It's not like we were spending your money on vacations. She paused just long enough. We just needed a little help getting stable. I looked at Daniel. He was looking at his hands. Daniel, I said, do you want to tell me what you think? He looked up. He seemed to be choosing carefully. I miss you, Mom. I want things to be okay. And I think if you could just help us get through this rough patch. How long is the rough patch? I asked. He blinked. What? How long do you estimate the rough patch will last? 6 months? A year? 3 years? I'm asking because I've been helping with rough patches for 14 months, and I'd like to understand when the patch ends. Kayla's composure shifted, just slightly, a tightening around the eyes. I don't think that's a fair way to characterize what we've been asking for, she said. I have records, I said. I have every text, every amount, every stated reason. I've documented all of it. The room was very quiet. Something moved across Kayla's face, fast, controlled, but there. Not surprise, exactly, more like the recalibration of someone who had just discovered the terrain was different from the map she'd been using. "Why would you document it?" Daniel asked, and he sounded genuinely confused, which told me he hadn't known to be worried about documentation, which told me a number of things about who had been managing his awareness. "Because I'm a bookkeeper," I said simply. "I keep records. It's what I do." Kayla stood up. Not dramatically, smoothly, controlled, but it was a premature standing, and we both knew it. "I think you've made your position very clear," she said. "I think you've decided I'm the enemy and nothing we say today is going to change that." "I haven't decided anything about you," I said. "I've decided about me." Daniel stood too, following her lead, and that gesture, that small, unconscious mirroring, was its own evidence. He looked at me from the doorway, and I saw something in his face that wasn't anger. It was something closer to conflict, to a man who was being asked to leave a room he wasn't sure he wanted to leave. He looked at me the way he used to look at Gerald and me when he was a teenager and had done something wrong and didn't know yet how to say so. I remembered that look. I had not seen it in years. "I love you," I said to him. "That hasn't changed." They left. I heard the car back out and drive away. The house was very still. I stood in the living room and listened to the silence settle back in around me, the way water closes over a stone. I sat in the living room for a while after that, in Gerald's armchair. I had moved it in there from the bedroom 2 years ago, when I stopped being able to sleep and started sitting up late. And I let the shaking in my hands slow down, because my hands had been shaking through the whole encounter, not from fear exactly, from the effort of staying still when everything in me wanted to either apologize or shout. I did neither. For the next 4 days, I did nothing regarding Daniel or Kayla. I tended my garden. I went to work at the dentist's office on Tuesday and Thursday. I had dinner with Renee on Wednesday. I slept, genuinely slept, for the first time in weeks. I let the silence sit between us. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop. 2 weeks after they left my porch, I mailed a letter. Not an email, not a text. A letter, printed and signed, sent certified mail to Daniel's address, the apartment I had helped furnish, in the building whose security deposit I had covered. I had written 7 drafts over those 2 weeks, working at the kitchen table in the evenings, reading each one aloud to hear where the emotion overtook the facts. The final version was 4 pages, clear, dated, numbered, written in the flat, accurate language of a woman who had been keeping records for 34 years. The letter laid out everything, every transfer with date, amount, and the exact text Daniel had sent requesting it, a side-by-side. What Daniel had said the money was for, and what I had since been able to observe about how it was actually used. The trips, the purchases, the inconsistencies, the pattern of requests always originating with Kayla, always relayed through Daniel, always accompanied by a report of Kayla's emotional state, the wedding, the date, the call the following evening, the exact words. It was only for special people. I did not call anyone names. I made no accusations of character. I simply laid out what had happened in sequence with documentation. And at the end, I wrote this: "Daniel, I am writing this because I love you and because I believe you deserve to see the full picture. I am not asking for the money back. I am not asking you to choose. I am asking you to look at what is written here and tell me honestly whether this is the family life you intended to build." I sealed the envelope myself, pressing the flap down firmly, and held it for a moment at my kitchen table before I put it with my things for the morning. It was the most important document I had ever prepared that wasn't for someone else. Every other thing I had typed neatly and filed away in 30 years of bookkeeping had been for clients, for Gerald's estate, for institutions that required paperwork. This one was for my son. This one was for me. I dropped it at the post office on a Tuesday morning. The clerk scanned the certified mail receipt, handed me my copy, and I drove to work at the dentist's office and filed accounts receivable for 3 hours as though it were an ordinary day. It was not an ordinary day. The letter arrived on Thursday. I know because Daniel called me Thursday evening, not from anger the way I had expected, but from something quieter and harder to read. He said he had read the letter. He said he needed time to think. His voice was careful in a way that told me Kayla was nearby. I said, "Take all the time you need." Friday morning, Kayla called. This was a different Kayla from the one who had come to my porch. Not the poised performer, not the warm overture, not even the controlled threat. This Kayla was loud. She told me I had attacked her. She told me the letter was harassment. She told me she was going to talk to a lawyer. She told me I had destroyed my relationship with my son and that she hoped I was satisfied. Her voice cracked in several places, and I noticed that even her cracking sounded strategic. Not because I was certain it was, but because I had stopped giving her the benefit of the doubt. I let her finish. Then I said, "Kayla, everything in that letter is documented. If you'd like to have a factual conversation about any of it, I'm available." "There's nothing to have a conversation about," she said, her voice breaking at the edges with what might have been genuine emotion or might have been the frustration of a plan failing. "You have made up your mind about me from the beginning. Everything I've done has been wrong to you. You have never given me a chance." "I gave you 14 months and $4,780, I said. Silence. It was a long silence, the kind that doesn't fill itself. "I want to talk to Daniel," I said. "Not through you, directly. If he would like to call me, I'll answer." She hung up. 2 hours later, Daniel called back. This time, he was somewhere else. I could hear road noise in the background, a car moving. He was not in the apartment. He was not, I realized, where she could hear him. That alone told me something had shifted. We talked for an hour and 40 minutes, the longest we had talked in over a year. He asked me questions. I answered them with the same documentation I had sent in the letter. He was quiet for long stretches in ways that were different from his earlier, managed silences. Those earlier silences had been empty or evasive. These were the silences of a person processing something they had been avoiding looking at directly. Near the end of the call, he said, "She told me you were going to try to break us up, that you'd been planning it from the start." "And what do you think now?" I asked. Another long silence. "I think," he said carefully, "that there are things I didn't want to see." It wasn't a confession. It wasn't the full truth. Not yet. But it was the door opening. A man who had kept a door shut for 14 months, setting his hand on the handle and not pulling away. Sometimes the beginning of clarity sounds exactly like that. Quiet, tentative, the first honest sentence someone has spoken in a long time. That was enough. He came on a Sunday, alone. He knocked on the front door of the yellow house on Birchwood Lane at 11 in the morning, and when I opened it, he looked younger somehow. Or not younger exactly, but less armored. The way people look when they stop performing something they've been holding for a long time. He was wearing an old flannel shirt I recognized from years ago, one he'd had since college, and I don't know why that detail mattered to me. But it did. It felt like evidence of something, like he had chosen, in some small, unconscious way, to come back to a version of himself I knew. I made coffee. Real coffee. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had sat at 3 a.m. with my ledger open, the same table where this whole reckoning had begun. And Daniel talked for a long time before I said much of anything. He told me about the pattern he had seen once he let himself look at it, how requests for money had always come from Kayla, sometimes as suggestions, sometimes as clear instructions, and how he had told himself he was helping us both, bridging a gap, acting as translator between two people who hadn't connected easily. He had not, until he read the letter with all of it laid out in sequence, allowed himself to see that he was not the bridge. He was the mechanism. He had been the voice delivering her requests and the face absorbing my concern, while she stood comfortably behind both. He told me about the wedding, how Kayla had said she wanted something intimate, just us. How he had agreed because he was tired of conflict at that point in their relationship, and because she had told him I wouldn't understand and would make it about herself. He had known, on some level, that not telling me was wrong. He had told himself he'd explain it to me gently, afterward. He had let Kayla make the call. And then she had made the call. Literally, the evening after, telling me the news in the most cutting way possible. And he had let that happen too, standing nearby and saying nothing. He looked at the table when he said that part. He told me that he was sorry. He said it simply, without choreography, looking at the wood grain of the table I had owned since before he was born. And then he looked up and said it again, directly, with his eyes steady on mine. "I'm sorry, Mom." I did not tell him it was fine, because it wasn't fine. I did not tell him I had already forgiven him, because real forgiveness isn't a greeting card. It's a process, and we were only at the beginning of it. I told him that I heard him, that I had needed to hear it, and that I was glad he was sitting in that chair. "What happens now?" he asked. "With Kayla and me?" "That's yours to figure out," I said. "I'm not part of your marriage. I wasn't invited to it." He absorbed that. He didn't flinch from it, which told me something. Then he said, "I'm going to pay back the money." I had not asked for this. I want to be clear. I had written in the letter explicitly that I was not asking for repayment. But Daniel had thought it through on his own and had decided that repaying it on his own terms, without Kayla's involvement, was part of reclaiming something, not just for me, for himself. He said he'd set up a monthly transfer from his personal account, an account Kayla did not have access to, which told me that he had already taken some steps in the direction of financial separation. He had been thinking about this before he arrived at my door. He had come prepared. I said I would accept it. Kayla called 3 times while he was at my house. He looked at the phone each time, turned it face down, and did not answer. He did not explain or apologize for the calls. He simply chose 3 times in 2 hours not to be redirected. I noticed each choice and said nothing. When he left that afternoon, we hugged at the front door, a real hug, not a courteous one, the kind where you hold on for a second longer than is strictly necessary. He told me he had made an appointment with a counselor for the following week. Alone. The following Tuesday, I received a certified letter from an attorney in Kayla's name. It made vague claims about the distress my letter had caused and hinted at defamation. Ellen Marsh looked it over and called me the same afternoon. She said it was a bluster letter. No specific claims, no real legal basis, designed to frighten a woman who might not know she had options. She drafted a brief, firm response on my behalf, citing the documented and factual nature of everything in my letter. noting that all correspondence had been accurate and supported by records, and making clear that any further legal posturing should be directed to her office. We never heard from Kayla's attorney again. In the weeks that followed, Daniel met with a financial counselor, something he arranged himself without prompting, and discovered that 2 credit cards in his name carried balances he had not fully tracked, charges he had either not made or not questioned at the time. He did not tell me the details of those discoveries. He told me only that there was more to untangle than he had realized, and that he was untangling it steadily, one thread at a time. Kayla moved out of their apartment 6 weeks after Daniel's visit to my house. She moved in with her parents in a suburb of Cleveland. Daniel stayed in the apartment and renegotiated the lease in his name only. The building manager, Daniel mentioned this later without drama, had apparently told him that the security deposit would be returned to whoever was listed as the primary leaseholder. Daniel was now that person. I did not celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate in the wreckage of a young marriage, however necessary the wreckage had been. But I felt something that evening that was real and quiet and mine. The return of a feeling I hadn't had since Gerald was alive. The feeling that my house was connected to something solid. That the yellow house on Birchwood Lane was not just a place where I waited for a phone to ring. It was a home again. 6 months passed, and then a year. I do not want to overstate the speed of healing, because that would be dishonest, and I have learned, at some cost, that honesty is worth more than a satisfying arc. The first months after Daniel's visit were still complicated. There were calls that felt tentative, silences that held old weight. There were evenings when I sat in Gerald's armchair and thought about the year I had lost, the money, the wedding I would never get back, the photographs I would never be in. Grief is not always about death. Sometimes it's about absences that were chosen by people who are still alive. But things moved, slowly, genuinely, the way real things do. Daniel and I started having Sunday calls again. Not every other week, not when he had time, but every Sunday reliably, the way we had before. They were different calls now, more honest, more weighted, occasionally uncomfortable in ways that meant they were real. He talked to me about the counseling, about what he was learning about the patterns he had allowed to form in his life. He did not ask me to validate his choices or villainize Kayla. He was doing something harder than that, which was looking at his own part honestly. I respected him for it more than I told him. By spring, he drove out to Columbus and spent a weekend. He slept in his old room. He fixed the cracked front step. Finally, after all these years, with a bag of concrete and a tutorial he watched on his phone. I stood in the yard and watched him work, and the feeling was enormous and quiet, and I did not say anything because I didn't need to. My own life had expanded in ways I hadn't anticipated. The enforced clarity of the previous year, the forced reckoning with what I was willing to accept and what I wasn't, had done something I hadn't planned. It had made me more deliberate about everything. I took on 2 additional clients at the dentist's office, referred by Patricia, my financial advisor. I joined a walking group through the church I had been attending inconsistently for years. I spent more time with Margaret and Renee. I planted a cutting garden in the backyard, dahlias, zinnias, sweet William, that Gerald would have called excessive and secretly loved. I was not lonely. I had been lonely for a long time without fully naming it, filling the space with anxiety and transfers and the anxious labor of being needed in ways that weren't good for me. Now I was simply busy, in the way that good days are busy, full of things that were mine. Kayla's life, by contrast, had not produced what she had constructed it to produce. I learned this not through gossip, I want to be clear about that, but through Daniel, who was honest with me about the broad shape of things without venting or performing grievance. Kayla had moved back to Cleveland and then moved again to an apartment of her own. The marketing freelance work had not materialized into anything stable. Her parents, she had apparently discovered, were not the financial resource she had assumed. They had their own constraints, their own limits, their own version of the conversation I had been the first to have. She had found a job in retail management, which was honest work, but far from the life she had been building toward. Daniel did not seem to feel satisfaction in any of this. He felt sad, I think, in the complicated way you feel when you've watched someone choose a direction that was never going to take them where they intended. He had loved her, in the way you love people when you are 30 and you want to believe you can shape things together. That love didn't vanish because it had been exploited. It just became something he had to carry carefully, like an object that was both precious and broken. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday in February, 18 months after the day I had sat at my kitchen table with a cold cup of chamomile tea and first understood what had been done to me. Daniel called me that evening. He sounded tired and clear. "It's done," he said. "I know," I said. "How are you?" "I'll be okay." And I believed him, because by then I had watched him make real choices, difficult, unglamorous, adult choices, for over a year. He was the man I had raised him to be. He had just taken a long detour to get back to himself. I told him I was making chili that weekend if he wanted to drive out. He said he'd be there Saturday. He was. Looking back, here is what I know. Silence is not the same as peace. For 14 months I kept the peace, and it cost me my voice, my money, and my place at my own son's wedding. The moment I chose honesty over harmony, things became harder, and then slowly, real. You cannot pour from an empty cup, and you cannot rebuild a relationship from a position of endless self-erasure. So I ask you, what would you have done? If this story moved you, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs it. Thank you for listening.